We've got breaking news tonight and several major bombshells in the Russia investigation. First up, according to multiple reports, President Trump officially not a target in either the Robert Mueller probe or the investigation of his personal attorney, Michael Cohen. We're told Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein told the president last week during a visit to the White House that conversation, apparently, the reason the president told reporters that he did not have any plans to fire Mueller or Rosenstein. It could also explain why the president was so forceful yesterday in declaring the Russia investigation as nothing more than a witch hunt.
There's no collusion. There was no collusion with Russia other than by the Democrats. This was really a hoax created largely by the Democrats as a way of softening the blow of a loss. This is a hoax. As far as the investigation, nobody has ever been more transparent than I have.
But there is still a major caveat here. The fact that the president is not a target doesn't mean that he is in the clear. Joining me now, Harvard Law School professor, attorney, it is Alan Dershowitz. He's also the author of the brand new book, Trumped Up. There it is, red, white, and blue. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank
you.
So
what do these developments mean?
Well, I think they mean that at the moment, before there's been an investigation of the Cohen materials, before there's been an attempt to flip Cohen and make him into a witness, he's not a target. There is no evidence that the president committed any crimes. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that they have finally come to realize, after I've been lecturing them for a year, that collusion is not a crime. So even if there were evidence of collusion, which I don't think there is, it would not be a crime. And a president can't be charged with obstruction of justice for merely firing people, pardoning people, exercising his authority under Article 2 of the Constitution.
And obstruction of justice obviously is a very serious charge. And there are other people who have orbited in and out of the president's circle who've been charged with those types of procedural crimes. And they may see jail time. And, you know, there is the idea that in the legal community, there's a split as to whether or not a president can be indicted while he is in office.
But I'm right.
Of course you're right. You're here.
The Constitution is quite clear in my view. It says that the president can be impeached and removed, and after he's impeached and removed, he can be charged with a crime, or after he leaves office. The implication is pretty clear, and the Justice Department has itself ruled internally that a sitting president cannot be charged with a crime by the federal government.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean he can't be charged by a crime by the state government. That raises a really interesting constitutional question, and the Attorney General of New York is apparently doing some investigating, and he's just called for a new statute, a very interesting new statute.
A loophole, really.
Really a loophole that's directed at the Trump people, saying that if President pardons any of them, they won't be able to get the benefit of double jeopardy, and they could be prosecuted under New York law.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. It makes me wonder, can the president pardon himself?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question, and I don't think the president will ever have to do that. We'll never reach that, but he couldn't pardon himself from a state crime. The president only has authority over federal crimes.
Interesting, and maybe that's why we've seen the Mueller investigation sort of dip into New York State, and now you see, for political purposes, posturing by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and Eric Schneiderman, who's the Attorney General that you've spoken about. But let's talk about Michael Cohen. And, you know, there has been leaks and the idea that all it's going to take is one key player within the campaign or the administration to flip on the president, and it's going to bring down his entire presidency. They said that of Michael Flynn. They said that of Flynn's son. They said that of Paul Manafort. They said that of Rick Gates. And now, supposedly, Michael Cohen is the one that, if he does, in fact, flip, he could do the most damage to the president. Do you believe that?
Well, we don't know whether the president did anything wrong. I'm not going to presume guilt on the part of anybody, certainly not the president of the United States. And we don't know whether they're going to charge Cohen. I think they probably will, because they'd be so embarrassed if they raided his office and they end up finding nothing and charging him with nothing. But the combination has to be threefold. One, they charge Cohen with a serious crime. Second, they flip him. And third, he not only sings, but he composes. That is, he elaborates, because he knows that the better the story, the better the deal. That's something that everybody must fear from witnesses who know them.
Yeah, the more he gives special counsel and, well, not necessarily special counsel, but the more he gives these prosecutors, the less time he'll have to spend
But
in
the
jail.
guy who knows more about this than anybody else is Rudy Giuliani, who was one of the most effective and successful prosecutors in the history of the Southern District. So I think it was probably a very wise decision for the president to bring Giuliani on board. He knows all the tricks. He knows all the tactics. He's used them, and effectively.
And also, Giuliani is a politician. And, you know, it's something that I pointed out today on The Five, which I think is really critical. You have to have someone who knows the law, but you also have to have someone who understands the perceptions, the political perceptions, and how any of these decisions might affect the midterms and the 2020 presidential campaign.
Nobody should underestimate Rudy Giuliani's ability as a lawyer. I have been against him in several cases. I beat him in one. He beat me in one. He's an extraordinary lawyer. His cross-examinations are legion.
Was he a better lawyer than a mayor?
Oh, I think he was a good mayor. He was a very good lawyer. He was an extraordinary lawyer. We disagreed a lot. He would invite me down to talk to his U.S. attorneys. I would invite him up to talk to my legal ethics class. You know, we always disagreed. He's a Yankee fan. I'm a Red Sox fan. But, you know, we're friends.
I think it's interesting because if Giuliani is successful and he does somehow wrap up the Mueller investigation and gives both special counsel and the president a graceful out, Jeff Sessions is in some deep yogurt with the president. And I don't think it's going to be long before he resigns. I don't even think the president is going to have to fire him. If Giuliani is successful here, do you think he's a natural successor as the Attorney General?
I'm not sure he wants the job. I think he might have been able to have it if he wanted it earlier. He wanted to be Secretary of State. Look, Sessions really pulled the wool over the president's eyes. He should have told him before he accepted the job, look, I'm going to accept the job, but I'm going to recuse myself from the most important investigation. The president would have responded, I want a full-time Attorney General, not a part-time Attorney General.
Yeah, it's like selling a house and not telling the buyer you have rats and termites and ghosts.
And I think now he could actually get back and not be recused when it comes to the Southern District case, because that's not about Russia or about collusion. He's not a witness. He's not a subject. So I don't understand why, if these cases are separate as they claim they are, why Sessions can't come back and take over from Rosenstein, who should be recused from the case because he is a witness.
And there seem to be a few conflicts of interest there. Fascinating discussion. Please come back.
I'd love to.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good to talk to you.